Hi, my name's Tom and welcome back to my channel, where today we're cracking on with another episode in my series Politix, or Neoliberalism and Chill, in which we look at Netflix and politics and the point at which the two meet. If you've yet to check out the introductory video in which I really lay out what I'm hoping to achieve with this series, then I'll pop a link to that up in the top corner. Today, however, we're going to be looking at millennials and the representation of this generational grouping within Netflix's original programming. We're going to both be looking at how these representations reflect the reality of being loosely 23 to 37 in contemporary society, but also how they engage with the popular myth of the millennial. See, when we come to ask big questions about the relationship between society and culture, we often do on a purely intellectual level. So we might look at political rhetoric or changing social opinions and social attitudes. However, today, what I wanted to start off this series with was by looking not necessarily at the politics of what we think or say, but instead at the politics of what we do. And representations of millennials within Netflix's original programming provides us with a really interesting opportunity to do just that. Because, as we'll see, although there are some observable differences in political and social attitudes among millennials in comparison to the previous two living generations, usually referred to as Generation Xers and Baby Boomers, it seems that particularly in media representations of this group, there is a consternation not necessarily with what millennials think, but primarily with the behaviours and attitudes and activities they engage in. Through placing millennials at the heart of their text then, shows such as Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and Master of None, among others, it really engage with this idea with what it is to be a millennial. They inquire into how we as a society see millennials, as well as how millennials see themselves, as well as providing many opportunities for these programs to subvert, support, and otherwise engage in the popular myth of what it is to be a millennial. So let's start off by taking a quick look at who we're talking about when we're talking about millennials. The term millennial, I feel like I've used that word an awful lot already in this video, or millennial generation, is widely said to have stemmed from William Strauss and Neil Howe's book, Generations, The History of America's Future. The book is an attempt to periodicize the history of America, from the establishment of the first successful colonies in the 16th century to the present day. And it does so through breaking that long period of time up into generational groupings, of which millennials were, at the point of publication, the most recent. In their later book, Millennials Rising, Strauss and Howe define this generation further as being born roughly post-1982, and the general consensus tends to be that the period of birth for millennials ends around the mid to late 1990s. In beginning to pinpoint what it is that makes this generation unique in comparison to those generations which have gone before it, for researchers it is mainly the shared experiences that this group has been through which bring them together. The Pew Research Centre, for one, highlights that most millennials were between the ages of 5 and 20 when the 9/11 terrorist attack shook the nation, and many were old enough to comprehend the historical significance of that moment. Millennials also grew up in the shadow of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which contributed to the intense political polarization that shapes the current political environment. And most millennials were between 12 and 27 during the 2008 election, where the force of the youth vote became part of the political conversation and helped elect the first black president. Where researchers may be interested primarily in what millennials have experienced, however, it certainly seems to me that in the popular consciousness, we are far more interested in what millennials do and how they behave. Kate Alexander Shaw suggests that, in the media, millennials are alternately stereotyped as demanding dreamers and materialistic consumers, umbilically attached to their smartphones. Millennials look set to be caricatured as a generation of sheltered social media complainers with unrealistic expectations of the world. Indeed, the conception of millennials in the cultural imaginary is perhaps typified by a video that went viral in 2017, in which advertising executive turned motivational speaker Simon Sinek blames a mixture of participation trophies, overindulgent parents, and social media for making millennials unhappy, unproductive, and unengaged. Now, it is far from a revolutionary statement for me to point out that any attempt to characterize millennials and each and every millennial as some kind of totalizing whole is a falsity. No one can summarize an entire generation. But, however much we might disagree with Sinek's provocations, or those media representations referred to by Shaw, it is broadly useful to be able to differentiate between different generations. And even if it wasn't, it's still something that people are going to do, and thus a phenomenon worth exploring. So, rather than simply critiquing the notion that millennials can be defined with these broad strokes, what we're going to do today is instead focus upon how these distinctions between millennials and previous generations have been drawn. And furthermore, we'll look at how these distinctions play out in a number of Netflix original shows. Because, from those media representations we looked at just a moment ago, I think we can see that this generational difference is often characterized by a real consternation with the exhibited behaviours of millennials above all else. For one, a supposed over-reliance upon technology pops up time and time again. Yet, I think we can also see a large preoccupation amongst older generations with the broader life choices and life decisions made by millennials. Let's begin by taking a look at Tina Fey and Robert Carlock's Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. The plot of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt centres around Kimmy, played by Ellie Kemper, who was kidnapped at the age of 14 and placed in a bunker by Reverend Richard Wayne Gary Wayne, played by John Hamm, for 15 years. In episode 1, we meet Kimmy having just been freed from that bunker, and the show follows her as she attempts to reassemble her life after moving to New York City. Much of the humour of the show revolves around Kimmy's attempts to reorientate herself culturally within the present day. The world has moved on, both in terms of technology and what constitutes popular culture. Though undoubtedly herself a millennial, Kimmy's 15-year separation from society means that in earlier seasons, she often views Titus and particularly Zan's reliance upon technology with skepticism. Essentially, she views these technologies through the eyes of a Generation Xer or baby boomer, who has not grown up with these communication technologies at hand. And although the example of a millennial being more likely to turn to an app of some description to solve a problem in a manner that a baby boomer might not is a fairly simple example, it is a useful one to draw upon in order to provide a firm theoretical backing for some of the more in-depth discussions we'll be having later on. Some of you may have heard of Mark Prensky's famous differentiation between digital immigrants and digital natives. Essentially, what Prensky argues is that millennials, as digital natives, have grown up with modern communication technologies at hand. It is therefore part of how they have been trained to interact with the world, and thus when seeking to carry out an activity or solve a problem, it is perhaps no surprise that they'll very quickly turn to this form of technology. Digital immigrants, on the other hand, a large portion of Generation X and all baby boomers, came of age before contemporary communication technologies were available, and thus, to them, these technologies are an addition to the way they interact with the world, rather than a go-to. Much of Prensky's reasoning for laying this out in a journal article was to push aside some of the judgment, and to suggest that, if technology was going to be a massive part of how digital natives engage with the world, then rather than looking down at them, educators should adjust their teaching methodologies accordingly. Although Kimmy herself lacks the same outright suspicion to technology that characters such as Lillian portray, she is in this regard alienated from her own generation. And in order to catch up, we essentially see Kimmy having to be acculturated towards being as close to a digital native as possible. And I think one of the most notable things about Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt's handling of this issue is that, while the series does often utilise Kimmy's alienation from her own generation as a manner in which to point to some of the absurdities of our digital culture, her acculturation into it does not change her as a human being. In contrast to the suggestions of provocateurs like Sinek, a shift towards a more tech-centred life does not make Kimmy any more self-centred or ignorant towards others. Through this acculturation process, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt problematicises the notion that contemporary communication technologies are either the symptom or the cause for millennials' outlook upon the world. Instead, it simply presents them as another technological development in the same way that there have been other technological shifts throughout history. And this is perhaps a rather simplistic observation, yet it does set us up to discuss an element which I think is presented within Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt as a defining factor in how millennials view the world. See, much of the charm of the show emanates from Kimmy's somewhat naive relationship with the world. Partly, this is conceived as being a symptom of having grown up in small-town Durnsville, Indiana, but much of it also originates in the stunted development experienced by the three youngest of the so-called Indiana Mole women. On emerging from the bunker, Cindy, despite now being in her late 20s, is still wearing her braces, and this, alongside Kimmy's fashion decisions throughout the series, serve as visual representations of the deeper psychological effects of their experience. We see these most extremely through Gretchen, who, multiple times and in multiple seasons, finds herself dragged back into a cult of one form or the other. Where Gretchen shows signs of being irreparably psychologically damaged through this stunted development, however, Kimmy, in a far subtler manner, is portrayed as experiencing something closer to a delayed coming of age. Having lost to the bunker the years in which she should have had a number of formative experiences, she is now having to catch up. The naming of episodes speaks directly to this. Among them, Kimmy gets a job, Kimmy goes on a date, Kimmy drives a car. Traditionally, these are not things which we expect someone in their late 20s to be doing for the first time. Now, for Kimmy, this is undeniably a cause of being in the bunker, yet other characters who are not in the bunker equally display a level of naivety. Titus and Dong are similarly childlike in their mannerisms and understanding of the world. Interestingly then, where Kimmy's time in the bunker should have separated her in terms of development from people her own age, in reality she is entirely in step with them. And here we find the show intersecting with a real-world phenomenon. Over the past few years, multiple studies from organisations such as the Centre for Generational Kinetics and the National Centre for Family and Marriage Research have suggested that millennials are delaying certain things which we might consider life milestones until later in life. They are likely to leave the parental home later, buy a house later, have children later if they decide to do any of these things. In fact, one poll found that the median age at which millennials consider themselves to be proper adult to be 30, a good 12 years after legally becoming so. The bunker is therefore not just a comedic narrative device used to set up the show. It also allows Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt to explore these themes of delayed adolescence and delayed adulthood among millennials. Yet what we must remember is that, despite the tone of the magazine articles and think pieces which often follow the release of such studies, any notion that there is a correct or normal time to carry out any life activity is far more social construction than biological certainty. And Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, partly through the use of the narrative device of the bunker, does explore these issues in a manner which takes away any notion of judgment. The series reminds us that the social norms laid out by previous generations are only that, not a biologically set formula for life. However, the narrative device of the bunker equally allows Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt to not engage in far more complex conversations as to why millennials might be making these decisions. The French theorist Michel de Certeau wrote at great length about why some human activity is deemed to be normal, while other activities are deemed to be subversive or deviant. Most interesting here is his delineation between two forms of human activity, which he called practices. Some he calls strategies, others tactics. Strategies are what we might consider to be the normative practices of a society. So, in this example, settling down by the age of 25, buying a house, having children, learning to drive. Tactics, on the other hand, are those activities which sit outside of these normative practices. Here, for example, delaying all of these things until a later age. De Certeau furthermore points out that those who practice through tactics rather than strategies are much more likely to have less power than those who practice through strategies. Because the normative practices of a society, rather than being dragged from thin air, are usually rooted around those with the most power within that society. Millennials as a generation vary immensely in economic, social, and cultural capital. Yet what is clear is that, certainly in the context of the global West, the economy has shifted so that millennials are, broadly speaking, less financially well off than their generational forebears. To take the house buying example, financial analysts recently predicted that house prices in the US were likely to rise at 4.3% through 2018, compared to an average growth in earnings of just 2.8%. Thus, it is perhaps no surprise that many millennials are still renting until much later in life. It's not even necessarily an active choice, but simply due to the unaffordability of that act. In truth, the normative practices or strategies of our society, such as settling down by 25, are formulated around a generational grouping whose buying power was such that these were achievable goals. Rather than simply being deviations from societal norms for the sake of deviation then, I think instead we have to view some of these decisions by millennials as being tactics, the practices of a disempowered group. Delaying many of these activities is in many ways simply a response to a changing economic reality. While Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt may seek to detach any judgment from the so-called delayed adulthood of millennials then, the bunker and the money given to Kimmy by a game show in Season 1, Episode 1 allows the show to do so without engaging in such discussions of disempowerment. The show explores heavily the consequences of fundamental shifts in the global economy, while sidestepping that economic shift itself almost entirely. A show which does begin to probe into the realities of the millennial economy is Master of None, created by Aziz Ansari and Alan Young, and starring Ansari in the lead role. Dev is a struggling actor who has had one or two breaks, but nothing substantial, other than a frozen yogurt advert when we meet him at the beginning of Season 1. Interestingly, similar to Kimmy, Cindy and Gretchen, we here find another set of characters who, for the age that they are, display somewhat adolescent behaviours. Particularly, Eric Wareheim's performance as Arnold Baumheiser fits this archetype, but also Dev himself often breaks into cutesy mannerisms. Beneath this, however, partly due to the show not being as definitively a comedy as Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Master of None strikes a much more serious tone when it comes to discussions of delayed adulthood. In Season 1, Episode 1, for example, there is a genuinely well-observed narrative which interrogates the decision to delay having children, in a context in which such decisions often centre around millennials being too self-obsessed to procreate. The episode reminds us that deciding to focus on a career and potentially have children at a later date can actually have a real emotional cost to someone who does not want to have children. In this, there is a reminder of the emotional cost of engaging in a tactic rather than a strategy. Societal norms are very endearing to us, and if someone chooses to engage in a tactic rather than a strategy, they can often feel left out. Most instructive, however, is the closing arc of Season 1, in which Dev makes an attempt to settle down with his love interest, Rachel. Now, as I'm likely to be running some clips over this bit, it's important to mention the flat, because this is a very nice flat. An article on the real estate website Brick Underground suggested that a Williamsburg apartment, such as Dev's, would be likely to set him back around $2,700 a month. And that's before we take into account quite how spectacular a living space it is. There is therefore some creativity with the truth here, reminiscent of the highly unaffordable apartments of the characters of Friends some decades earlier. In the case of Dev and Rachel, we see a real desire to settle down and even a consideration of marriage, though neither seem highly pressured into it should it be something they don't want to do. Yet what chafes most at Dev and Rachel's desire to be together is a highly insecure economy, which often has far greater demand on its employees than that of the latter half of the 20th century. Indeed, when looking to take up a promotion, Rachel's job insists she moves to Chicago for 6 months. Again, the societal norm which suggests that one should have settled down by this point of life is an inheritance from an era in which, at this age, someone would have found a long-term job. In an economic context in which job security is low and the pressure to be constantly upskilling high, not settling down is often a necessary act, or indeed a tactic. In the end, it is not this ever more difficult attempt to align calendars which does break Dev and Rachel apart. It is the fear that committing too much time to a relationship, which is not necessarily going to work out in the long term, might be a wasted effort. At this juncture, Rachel leaves for Japan while Dev heads to Italy, both leaving behind any attempt at settling down at all in exchange for the pursuit of cultural experiences. And yes, we must acknowledge that the ability to simply fly to another continent on a whim necessitates huge amount of privilege which goes almost unacknowledged here. Yet, we must view this decision not as a refutation of the contemporary economy's hold on Dev and Rachel, but instead as a logical conclusion of it. Because again, this reflects a real-world phenomenon. A study by the Harris Group in 2014 found that millennials were far more likely to value experiences, such as travel, over investment in material things. And this total disengagement, I think we must view as the ultimate tactic in a society which suggests it wants millennials to do one thing, yet the structure of that society almost entirely precludes them from doing so. Where delaying the buying of a house, notably an Anglo-American obsession that many of our European friends don't seem to share, might be one level of a tactic, disengaging from the idea of ever doing that takes this tactic even further. So, to conclude, media representations of millennials often display a great consternation with how the practices of this generation differ from those which went before. Often, these simple differences of practice are presented as objective moral failings on the part of that generation itself. Both Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and Master of None go some way to normalising the practices of millennials. In short, both shows attempt to show the practices of millennials as being different rather than lesser. And this is perhaps no surprise in shows which are targeted at that very audience. The clear difference is the method through which one displays these practices as simply being okay and acceptable, and the other which presents them as being a response to a changing economy, which more and more has left significant amounts of millennials as being significantly disempowered in relation to the previous generations. Thank you very much for watching this video if you've made it this far. Again, this is something slightly new that I'm trying, so if you've got any thoughts or feedback, then please do let me know. I think I'm kind of struggling to really get the tone of these videos, but hopefully that I'm getting there. If you think this might be a vague net positive for the world, then please do consider giving it a thumbs up, and any thoughts which you want to put down below, please go ahead. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great week.